Okay, so you want to become rich in the Roman Empire. Sounds like a dream, doesn't it? You're living in the most powerful civilization on Earth, surrounded by magnificent buildings, bustling marketplaces, and merchants carrying goods from places you've never even heard of. Gold flows into the empire, silver coins change hands by the millions, and ships packed with grain, spices, silk, and olive oil arrive at Roman ports every single day. Surely becoming wealthy should be easy. Well, not exactly. Because despite all that wealth, most Romans never became rich. In fact, many spent their entire lives working just to put food on the table. So if Rome was generating enormous amounts of wealth, where was all the money actually going? And more importantly, how could someone like you get a piece of it? To answer that question, you first have to stop thinking like a tourist visiting ancient Rome and start thinking like an investor. Wealth isn't created by simply being surrounded by money. It's created by understanding how money moves. Every successful economy has a system. Somebody produces goods, somebody transports them, somebody finances the trade, somebody collects taxes, and somewhere along the way, someone earns a profit. The Roman Empire wasn't just an empire of soldiers and emperors. It was one of history's greatest economic machines, and once you understand how that machine worked, you'll begin to see why Rome stayed rich for centuries. Most people think Rome became wealthy because it conquered other nations. That's only part of the story. Winning a war can make you rich once. Running a productive economy can make you rich every single year. Imagine buying a successful business today. The purchase itself doesn't guarantee you'll stay wealthy forever. If the business stops making money, eventually your fortune disappears. Rome understood the same principle. Every conquered province wasn't simply another piece of land to control, it became another economic asset. Egypt supplied grain, Spain produced silver, North Africa exported olive oil, Greece contributed skilled craftsmen, wine, and marble. Britain provided metals. Each province specialized in producing something valuable, and instead of forcing every region to make everything, Rome connected them together into one enormous marketplace. That might not sound revolutionary today, but 2,000 years ago, it was one of the smartest economic decisions ever made. Imagine trying to bake your own bread, weave your own clothes, build your own furniture, and grow every piece of food you eat. You'd spend your entire life trying to survive. But if one person focuses only on farming, another only on blacksmithing, and another only on building ships, everyone becomes better at their specific job. Productivity increases, goods become cheaper to produce, trade expands. Economists today call this specialization, and it's still one of the biggest reasons modern economies grow. Rome didn't invent specialization, but it mastered it on a scale the ancient world had never seen before. Of course, specialization only works if people can actually exchange what they produce. Imagine you're a farmer in Egypt growing some of the finest wheat in the empire. That wheat doesn't have much value sitting in a warehouse along the Nile. It only becomes valuable when it reaches hungry people in Rome. Now imagine you're a merchant transporting that wheat. Every extra day on the road means paying workers, feeding animals, repairing wagons, and risking theft. Transportation isn't just about moving goods, it's about controlling costs. The cheaper and faster goods move, the more profitable trade becomes. Rome recognized this better than almost anyone else. That's why the empire invested enormous amounts of money into infrastructure. The famous Roman roads weren't built simply so armies could march faster. They were economic assets. They reduced transportation costs, connected distant markets, and made trade far more predictable. Bridges linked communities separated by rivers. Harbors welcomed merchant ships from across the Mediterranean. Warehouses stored valuable cargo until buyers arrived. Every improvement made the empire's economy slightly more efficient. Think about it this way. If a merchant could complete 2 trading journeys instead of 1 each year because of better roads, his income could nearly double without selling a single extra product. That's the power of infrastructure. But even efficient transportation isn't enough if nobody agrees on how to pay for things. Imagine traveling across 10 different countries today, and every city refuses to accept the money from the previous one. Every purchase would require exchanging currencies. Every transaction would involve uncertainty. Trade would slow dramatically. Rome solved much of that problem with something surprisingly simple: a trusted currency. The silver denarius became one of the most widely accepted coins in the ancient world. Soldiers received it as payment. Merchants accepted it in marketplaces. Taxes were often collected with it. Because so many people trusted the coin, buying and selling became much easier. Trust is one of the most valuable assets any economy can have. You can't see it. You can't hold it. But without it, markets struggle to function. Think about the last time you accepted a $20 bill. You didn't stop to wonder whether someone else would take it tomorrow. You trusted that it would still have value. Millions of Romans felt the same way about the denarius. That trust reduced friction in the economy. Fewer arguments over payment meant faster transactions. Faster transactions encouraged more trade. More trade generated more wealth. In modern finance, we might call this monetary confidence. Rome simply called it good business. Now imagine you've saved 100 denarii. It's not enough to buy a palace, but it's enough to start asking a different question. Should you spend it or should you invest it? Most people immediately think about opening a small shop or buying farmland. Those are reasonable options. But after spending a few days walking through the Roman Forum, you begin noticing something interesting. The busiest merchants aren't always the richest people in the city. Some of the wealthiest Romans don't sell anything at all. Instead, they provide the money that allows everyone else to do business. A merchant preparing to sail to Egypt needs capital to buy cargo. A mining operation in Spain needs equipment and labor before silver can be extracted. A landowner needs workers during harvest season. Every opportunity requires money before it can generate more money. Sound familiar? It should. The same thing happens today. Businesses borrow money to expand. Investors provide funding in exchange for future returns. Banks lend capital because idle money earns nothing. While Rome didn't have stock exchanges or online banking, the underlying principles were surprisingly similar. Capital flowed toward opportunities that promised profit. The more you observe, the more you realize that Rome's economy isn't built on coins. Coins are simply tools. Real wealth comes from movement. Grain moves from Egypt to Rome. Silver moves from Spain into circulation. Olive oil moves from North Africa across the Mediterranean. Taxes move from provinces into the imperial treasury. Investments move from wealthy citizens into commercial ventures. Money that sits still rarely creates more money. Money that circulates fuels the entire economy. And that's when you begin seeing Rome differently. Most people look at the Colosseum or the Pantheon and think about architecture. Investors would have seen something else. They would have seen government spending creating jobs. Stone had to be quarried. Materials had to be transported. Engineers had to be hired. Thousands of laborers earned wages that they later spent in local markets. Massive public projects weren't just symbols of power. They injected money back into the economy, supporting countless businesses along the way. In many respects, the Roman government had already discovered that strategic public investment could stimulate economic activity. From where you're standing, the future looks incredibly promising. Trade is booming, markets are crowded, roads are busy, merchant ships fill the harbors. The denarius is trusted across much of the known world. Opportunities seem endless. If there was ever a time to build wealth, this appears to be it. But every booming economy has a hidden weakness, and Rome is no exception. The larger the empire grows, the more expensive it becomes to maintain. Every new road must be repaired. Every new province must be governed. Every soldier guarding the frontier expects to be paid. Every public building requires maintenance. Prosperity has a price, and sooner or later, someone has to pay the bill. At first, nobody seems concerned. After all, trade is flourishing, taxes continue flowing into the treasury, and confidence remains high. But beneath the surface, the empire is becoming increasingly dependent on one simple assumption: that tomorrow's income will always be enough to pay for today's ambitions. As you'll soon discover, that assumption would eventually change the course of Roman history forever. And it all begins with a single silver coin that millions of people believed would always hold its value. The Roman Empire had a problem that almost every successful nation eventually faces. Success made it expensive. The more territory Rome controlled, the more soldiers it needed to defend its borders. Every new province meant more governors to appoint, more roads to maintain, more ports to protect, and more cities expecting public services. An empire isn't just built through conquest, it's maintained through constant spending. As long as tax revenue continued growing, nobody questioned the system. But economies rarely grow forever. Eventually, expenses begin growing faster than income, and that's exactly what happened to Rome. At first, the government had several ways to raise money. It could collect taxes, conquer new territory, or borrow from wealthy citizens. Conquering new land had always been Rome's favorite solution because every successful campaign brought back treasure, slaves, farmland, and new taxpayers. Victory often paid for itself. But by the 2nd century, Rome had expanded so far that finding profitable new territories became increasingly difficult. Instead of adding wealthy provinces, Rome found itself spending more money simply defending the enormous borders it already possessed. The empire had reached a point where maintaining what it owned became more expensive than acquiring something new. Think about running a business that's grown incredibly fast. During the early years, opening a new store increases profits because there are plenty of new customers. But eventually, every good location is already taken. Opening another store doesn't bring enough new business to justify the extra rent, payroll, and operating costs. Growth slows, but expenses continue climbing. That's the position Rome found itself in. The empire was enormous, but size alone no longer guaranteed prosperity. The government faced a difficult choice. It could raise taxes, reduce spending, or find another source of money. Raising taxes sounds simple until you remember who actually pays them. Farmers already struggled during poor harvests. Merchants complained whenever tariffs increased. Landowners used their political influence to protect their own wealth. Every tax increase created resistance somewhere in the economy. Higher taxes also discouraged production. If people believe they'll lose too much of what they earn, they're less motivated to invest, expand, or take risks. That's a lesson governments continue learning today. Reducing spending wasn't much easier. The Roman army couldn't simply be sent home. Border defenses still had to be maintained. Roads still needed repairs. Public buildings still required maintenance. Grain distributions kept millions of citizens fed in major cities like Rome. Cutting these programs could create unrest, and unrest threatened political stability. The emperor needed the people to remain confident, even if the treasury was beginning to feel the strain. So Rome turned to another solution, one that has tempted governments throughout history whenever money becomes tight. Instead of creating more wealth, it changed the money itself. The Roman silver denarius had earned its reputation because people trusted the amount of silver inside each coin. The metal gave the currency value. But what if the government reduced the silver content while keeping the coin's face value exactly the same? On the surface, nothing appeared different. The coin still looked like a denarius. It still carried the emperor's image. It was still accepted in markets. But each coin now contained slightly less precious metal than before. That allowed the government to produce more coins from the same amount of silver. Initially, this seemed like a brilliant solution. Soldiers could still be paid. Government projects could continue. The treasury suddenly had more money available without officially raising taxes. Everyone appeared to benefit. But underneath the surface, something dangerous had begun. Imagine owning a pizza shop where every pizza normally contains 8 slices. One day, to save money, you quietly reduce every pizza to 6 slices while charging exactly the same price. At first, customers might not notice. But eventually, someone compares today's pizza with last month's. Word spreads, people realize they're getting less for their money, confidence begins to disappear. The same thing happened with Roman currency. Merchants started noticing that newer coins contained less silver than older ones. Some people began keeping older coins and spending the newer ones instead. Others demanded higher prices because they knew the money itself had become less valuable. Slowly, almost invisibly at first, prices started creeping upward. This wasn't because bread suddenly became more difficult to bake or because farmers forgot how to grow wheat. The economy still produced many of the same goods. What changed was the value of the money being used to buy them. Today we call this inflation. It's one of the simplest economic ideas to understand, but one of the easiest to overlook. Inflation doesn't always mean products become more valuable. Sometimes it simply means your money becomes less valuable. If twice as much money is chasing the same amount of goods, prices usually rise. Rome had unknowingly stepped onto a path that many governments throughout history would later follow. As confidence weakened, people adapted. Wealthy families preferred holding land, gold, or silver rather than large amounts of currency. Merchants demanded payment more quickly because they worried today's coins would buy less tomorrow. Some traders even refused certain coins altogether, insisting on older, purer currency whenever possible. Notice what's happening here. The real problem isn't just inflation, it's trust. Money only works because people collectively believe it will continue working tomorrow. The moment that belief starts fading, the economy changes. People spend differently, they invest differently, they save differently. Every financial decision becomes more cautious. That's why economists often describe trust as one of the most valuable resources in any economy. It can't be mined, it can't be printed, it can't be conquered, it has to be earned and protected. Rome spent centuries building that trust. But once it began weakening the very currency that held the empire together, rebuilding confidence became far more difficult. Meanwhile, another challenge was quietly growing in the background. Trade had always been one of Rome's greatest strengths. Merchant ships crossed the Mediterranean carrying grain from Egypt, wine from Greece, olive oil from North Africa, glass from Syria, and metals from Spain. Every successful voyage generated profits, created jobs, and filled government coffers with tax revenue. But Rome wasn't only importing necessities. Its wealthiest citizens developed an appetite for luxury goods from distant lands, silk from China, exotic spices from India, precious gems from the East. These weren't essential for survival, but they became powerful status symbols among Rome's elite. The problem was that these luxury imports often required payment in gold and silver. In other words, valuable metal was constantly leaving the empire to pay foreign merchants. That wasn't immediately disastrous, but over time, it created another pressure on Rome's monetary system. Precious metals became harder to replace while the government continued producing increasing numbers of lower quality coins. The foundation of Rome's economy was beginning to crack. Most ordinary citizens couldn't see the full picture yet. Markets still opened each morning. Merchants still filled the streets. The empire still looked powerful from the outside. But beneath that impressive appearance, the financial system that had fueled centuries of prosperity was becoming increasingly fragile. And history has shown us something remarkable. Empires rarely collapse because people wake up one morning and decide they're over. They weaken gradually. Confidence slips away, one decision at a time. A small compromise here, a short-term solution there, until eventually, problems that once seemed manageable become impossible to ignore. For Rome, that moment was approaching faster than anyone realized. And when it finally arrived, it wouldn't just change the value of the denarius, it would change the future of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known.